The HOA president stood in my driveway at 6 a.m., clipboard in hand, writing me a $500 fine for tire dumping. But those weren't just any tires, and I wasn't just any homeowner about to roll over. I'm Marcus, and I'd barely finished my morning coffee when I found that violation notice superglued to my garage door. Yeah, superglued. The sticky residue pulled paint right off when I tried to remove it. The charge? Unsightly automotive waste storage. 12 vintage racing tires that belonged to my late father. Here's what really gets my blood boiling. Veronica Hartwell, our self-appointed neighborhood dictator, was literally jogging past my house in her designer tennis whites, checking her work with that entitled smirk. These tires weren't garbage. They were worth $15,000 to collectors. But Princess Veronica decided my modest house was ruining her perfect little kingdom. The smell of desert morning mixed with the scent of fresh injustice. She had no idea what she'd just started. What would you do if your HOA attacked your family's legacy? Drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what's your worst HOA nightmare? Let me tell you how I ended up in this suburban war zone. 3 years ago, I was living the dream in Tucson. Decent pension from 30 years fixing fighter jets, modest savings, and plans to travel with my wife, Sarah. Then cancer took her in 8 brutal months, and 6 months later, Mom started asking me if I'd seen her husband. He's been dead for 15 years. So here I am in Willowbrook Estates, Phoenix's answer to suburban purgatory disguised as paradise. Average home value $385,000. Mine worth $290,000. Guess which one Veronica treats like a festering wound on her perfect neighborhood body. The community's got 847 homes split between retirees with too much time and young families drowning in mortgage payments. Most folks are decent enough, but then there's Veronica Hartwell, 48 years old, real estate queen of Willowbrook, and part-time dictator with a god complex. Picture this: bleached blonde hair shellacked into submission, tennis whites that cost more than my truck payment, and a white Mercedes that gets detailed twice a week. She's been HOA president for 6 years, elected by a whopping 23 votes because most people assume HOA meetings are just bingo for control freaks. Her campaign promise? Protecting property values through excellence. Translation: I'll destroy anyone who doesn't fit my suburban fantasy. The morning heat was already brutal at 6 a.m., that dry Phoenix heat that sucks moisture from your lungs like a vacuum. I could smell the creosote bushes warming up, hear the distant rumble of early commuters, and, most annoyingly, the rhythmic crunch of designer jogging shoes on gravel as Veronica took her victory lap past my driveway. Here's what really twisted the knife. Those weren't just old tires. Dad spent 40 years running Southwest Tire and Auto, and I'd inherited his collection of vintage racing rubber. Firestone slicks from the 1980s, Goodyear Eagles from NASCAR's golden era, even Michelin rally tires worth $2,000 a set to the right collector. Total value? Around $15,000. I was planning to sell them to fund Mom's memory care when the time came. But Princess Veronica saw automotive waste because, in her twisted worldview, anything connected to blue-collar work was a threat to her precious property values. She'd already proven her discrimination with surgical precision. Miguel Ramirez got fined $300 for parking his landscaping truck in his own driveway. Commercial vehicle violation. Meanwhile, her buddy Janet parks a 30-foot RV in her side yard without a whisper. Then there was Dorothy Chen, 78-year-old widow who received a $200 citation for excessive decorative items. She had 4 garden gnomes that her late husband bought her. 4! But Veronica's next-door neighbor has a boat trailer, pool equipment, and what looks like a small aircraft hangar worth of junk, all perfectly fine because he drives a BMW. The fine was a masterpiece of petty tyranny, $500 for violating Section 12.3b, plus threats of daily $50 penalties and potential liens on my property. But the real gut punch was her handwritten note. Community standards exist for everyone's benefit. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in a less exclusive neighborhood. Less exclusive. Let that sink in. I stood there in my driveway, paint chips from her industrial-strength adhesive still stuck to my fingers, feeling something I hadn't experienced since my Air Force days. That cold, calculating calm that settles in right before you dismantle someone's entire world piece by piece. See, 30 years of aircraft maintenance teaches you about precision, patience, and what happens when people who think they're untouchable meet someone who actually knows how systems work. Every regulation has loopholes. Every tyrant has weaknesses, and every bully eventually picks on the wrong person. Veronica had just made the biggest mistake of her perfectly manicured life. She thought she was dealing with some pushover retiree who'd quietly pay her extortion fee and slink away. She had no idea she'd just declared war on someone who made his living ensuring multi-million-dollar death machines didn't fall out of the sky. Game on, princess. 2 days later, I'm sitting in Veronica's $600,000 living room for the monthly HOA board meeting, feeling like I'd been summoned to the throne room of suburban tyranny. The marble floors echoed every footstep like gunshots, and the fluorescent chandelier buzzed overhead like an angry hornet, casting harsh shadows across 3 board members who looked like hostages. "Mr. Torres," Veronica began, not bothering to look up from her leather-bound agenda, "your appeal regarding the automotive waste violation." I'd prepared like I was briefing a squadron commander. Professional appraisals from 3 collectors, photos proving neat storage, historical documentation. The whole package proved those tires were worth $15,000, more than her monthly shopping budget. "Mrs. Hartwell, those appraisals clearly show sentimental value doesn't override community standards," she interrupted, her expensive perfume mixing with the scent of barely contained contempt. "This neighborhood has appearance guidelines for a reason." Harold, the nervous board member, fidgeted with his wedding ring. "The documentation does seem comprehensive." Veronica's glare could have melted titanium. "The motion to uphold the fine stands. All in favor?" 3 hands shot up like they were controlled by the same puppet master. "Additionally," she continued with a sharp smile, "there's a $50 administrative fee for processing frivolous appeals." Frivolous. That word hung in the air like cordite after a weapons test. Instead of getting angry, I did something Veronica wasn't expecting. I smiled back and said, "Thank you for clarifying the HOA's position. I'll be sure to document this decision thoroughly." The next morning, while Princess Veronica thought she'd crushed another peasant rebellion, I was doing what I do best: systematic problem solving. Armed with my camera and 3 decades of investigative training, I began documenting every single violation in Willowbrook Estates. What I discovered was a masterclass in corruption disguised as community service. Janet Morrison, Veronica's tennis partner, boat trailer in her driveway for 18 months. 0 citations. The Hendersons, pool equipment, lawn mowers, and what looked like a small aircraft hangar worth of junk visible from the street. Clean record. But Miguel's work truck gets an instant $300 fine, and Dorothy's 4 garden gnomes trigger a citation. The discrimination was so blatant it was insulting. But here's where my aircraft maintenance background kicked in. I didn't just document the violations, I followed the money trail. Something about that administrative fee bothered me like a loose bolt on a control surface. Knowledge nugget. In Arizona, HOAs must enforce rules uniformly regardless of homeowner demographics or property values. Selective enforcement based on race, income, or personal relationships violates the Fair Housing Act and carries federal penalties. Takeaway: document discrimination patterns because the feds take housing violations very seriously, so I filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Housing, not because I expected immediate action, but because I needed that federal paper trail. When you're taking down institutional corruption, you build your case like you're investigating a crash, methodically, thoroughly, and with backup documentation for everything. While I'm playing federal investigator, neighbors started approaching me like I was running an underground resistance movement. Dorothy shuffled over with cookies and horror stories about Veronica's previous campaigns. Miguel shared his own documentation of selective enforcement. But the real bombshell came from Dorothy's casual comment about the HOA's beautification fund. Apparently, they'd been collecting extra fees for 3 years, $47,000 total, for neighborhood improvements that never materialized. That's when I made a discovery that changed everything. Public records requests are beautiful things. Within a week, I had copies of all HOA financial documents, and what I found made my blood pressure spike like a faulty altimeter. The beautification fund wasn't funding community improvements. It was funding contracts with Hartwell Landscape Solutions, owned by one Vincent Hartwell, Veronica's husband. $47,000 in no-bid contracts for community enhancement services that amounted to trimming 3 bushes and replacing a mailbox. The same mailbox that had been replaced 4 times in 2 years, each time billed as a separate project. Instead of confronting them directly, I did something that would make Veronica's perfectly manicured world implode. I quietly sent copies of these financial records to every homeowner in Willowbrook Estates, along with a detailed breakdown showing how their HOA fees had been funding the Hartwell Family Vacation Fund. The next morning, my phone started ringing at 6 a.m. Angry neighbors who'd just realized they'd been funding embezzlement disguised as landscaping. By noon, I had 17 people ready to join a class action lawsuit and 3 offers to help with whatever comes next. Veronica thought she was dealing with a grieving widower who'd pay his fine and disappear. Instead, she'd picked a fight with someone who made his living ensuring that broken systems got fixed, no matter how many people said it couldn't be done. The smell of desert morning mixed with the scent of justice finally being served. 3 days after my little document dump, a certified letter arrived with the kind of official seal that makes your stomach drop. I knew what it was before I opened it: Veronica's nuclear option. The return address read Hartwell & Associates Legal Services, because of course she had her own law firm too. Notice of intent to place lien screamed across the top in bold red letters. My fine had magically increased to $750 for continued non-compliance and obstruction of HOA authority. But here's the real kicker. They were threatening foreclosure proceedings if I didn't pay within 30 days. Foreclosure. Over 12 tires worth more than her monthly Mercedes payment. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, written in that special language lawyers use when they want to scare regular people into submission. Daily penalties, attorney fees, collection costs, the whole arsenal of financial terrorism. At the bottom, handwritten in Veronica's perfect penmanship, this matter could be resolved quickly with reasonable cooperation. Translation: bow down or lose your house, peasant. But here's where Veronica made her second critical miscalculation. Instead of removing those tires, I did something that would drive her absolutely insane while staying completely within the rules of her precious HOA covenant. I turned every single tire into a spectacular garden planter. While she was escalating to legal threats, I was deep diving into the original 1987 HOA covenant, the founding document of Willowbrook Estates. Buried in Section 15.4, I found a beautiful clause about decorative planters and garden features being encouraged to enhance community aesthetics. Encouraged, not regulated. Encouraged. The next morning, I was at Desert Bloom Nursery at opening time, chatting with Elena, the owner who'd been fighting her own HOA battles for years. "You want to turn tires into planters?" she asked, grinning like I'd just proposed the perfect heist. "I like your style. What kind of plants can handle Phoenix heat and make the biggest visual impact?" "Desert marigolds," she said. "Barrel cacti for year-round structure. Trailing lantana for explosive color. Plants that could survive a nuclear blast and look gorgeous doing it." By noon, I had 12 tire planters arranged artistically along my driveway, each one bursting with drought-resistant native plants and hand-painted wooden signs identifying the species. The contrast was stunning. Black rubber rings framing explosions of yellow, purple, and green desert life that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. Knowledge nugget. Most HOA covenants contain contradictory language that can be exploited with creative interpretation. The key is finding original documents that predate later amendments and working within those broader, more permissive guidelines. Takeaway. HOA rules often contradict themselves. Use their own words against them. The transformation was immediate and magical. Neighbors started stopping during their evening walks, kids pointed and giggled at the tire flowers, and even the grumpy UPS driver complimented my badass landscaping solution. But the real magic happened when Dorothy shuffled over with her watering can, eyes twinkling with 78 years of accumulated mischief. "Mind if an old lady helps tend your rebellion garden?" Within a week, I had an unofficial coalition of volunteer gardeners. Dorothy brought expertise from 4 decades of desert gardening. Miguel donated professional-grade drip irrigation from his landscaping business. Even Blake, the 16-year-old kid next door, started hanging around after school, asking questions about desert ecology and helping me install solar-powered accent lighting that made the gardens glow like alien landing sites. Meanwhile, Veronica was driving by my house multiple times daily, circling like a shark who'd lost her prey and couldn't understand why. I could see her through my window, phone pressed to her ear, probably calling every city department in Phoenix. The white Mercedes became a regular fixture, sometimes parked across the street for 20 minutes at a time while she photographed my tire gardens from every conceivable angle. searching desperately for violations. The smell of fresh mulch and blooming desert plants filled the air, mixing with the satisfaction of watching someone's carefully constructed dictatorship start to crumble one tire at a time. 2 weeks after installing my tire gardens, I received a call from Channel 12 News. Apparently, someone had sent them photos of the creative homeowner fighting HOA overreach with environmental innovation. The reporter wanted to do a feature story about desert sustainability meets neighborhood politics. Guess who was watching from her living room window when the news van pulled up? The interview was perfection. Standing next to my thriving tire gardens, I explained how HOA harassment had inspired an eco-friendly solution that increased property values while supporting native wildlife. The reporter ate it up, a feel-good story about creativity triumphing over bureaucracy. But the best moment came when they asked about the ongoing legal threats. I held up Veronica's lien notice and said, according to their own covenant, decorative planters enhance community aesthetics. I'm just following the rules more creatively than they expected. That evening, #TireGardenRebellion started trending on local social media. Photos of my planters were shared hundreds of times, with neighbors from across Phoenix asking for tutorials. Veronica had escalated to legal warfare and foreclosure threats. I'd responded by turning her attack into a viral environmental movement that made her look like the villain trying to destroy Captain Planet. The desperate crunch of her tires on gravel as she made her 6th drive-by of the day sounded suspiciously like the beginning of a very public meltdown. If I thought Veronica was unhinged before, the viral tire garden story pushed her into full-blown dictator meltdown mode. Within a week of the news broadcast, violations were hitting my mailbox like artillery shells. Monday, unlicensed landscaping modifications, $200 fine. Tuesday, excessive garden decorations creating visual disturbance, $150. Wednesday, noise violations during garden maintenance, $100. Thursday, potential rodent habitat concerns, $175. Rodent habitat, for plants that barely grew 6 inches tall. Each citation was more desperate than the last, Veronica's perfect penmanship getting sloppier with each swing of her bureaucratic axe. The woman was throwing legal spaghetti at the wall like a chef having a nervous breakdown during dinner rush. But Friday morning brought the nuclear option, an official city code enforcement inspection. The guy who showed up looked like he'd graduated college last week and still got his mom to pack his lunch. Bradley Henderson, code enforcement, he announced, clipboard trembling slightly. Anonymous complaint about junkyard conditions and environmental hazards. I almost burst out laughing. Environmental hazards? You mean these EPA-tested tire planters with their professional irrigation system and native desert plants? Well, he squinted at his paperwork like it was written in hieroglyphics. Tire rubber can allegedly leach chemicals? That's when I pulled out my environmental safety report from Desert Sustainability Solutions, clean as a surgical instrument. The kid's face fell like he'd just realized he was being used as someone's attack poodle. I'll file a report saying no violations found, he mumbled, practically sprinting back to his county vehicle. That evening, Dorothy shuffled over with information that made my blood pressure spike. That code enforcement boy? He's Harold's son, Bradley. Veronica called in a favor to get him assigned to your case. But here's the kicker. Dorothy had been doing her own investigation. I used to process municipal records for 40 years, honey. I know how to follow paper trails. She handed me a manila folder, thick enough to stop a bullet. Look at page 17. Page 17 nearly made me drop my coffee. A contract between the HOA and Henderson Environmental Consulting, Harold's side business, for $15,000 in community health assessments that consisted of walking around the neighborhood twice. The corruption wasn't just financial. It was a full family operation. Knowledge nugget time. In Arizona, HOA board members must disclose any financial conflicts of interest, and contracts with board members require homeowner approval. Failure to disclose these relationships constitutes fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Takeaway. When HOA board members hire their own companies, they're literally stealing from their neighbors. While Veronica was carpet bombing me with citations, I was quietly building a legal nuclear weapon. Formal requests for all HOA financial records, bank statements going back 5 years, every contract, every vendor payment, every mysterious administrative fee. But the real magic was happening in my neighborhood. 3 more families had created their own tire gardens in solidarity. Miguel's succulent display looked like modern art installation. Dorothy's herb garden attracted every butterfly in Phoenix and smelled like heaven on earth. Blake's environmental science project was so impressive, his teacher asked if she could bring other classes to see it. We'd accidentally created the most beautiful block in Willowbrook Estates, and property values were climbing faster than Veronica could issue violations. Wednesday night, I'm watering my gardens when I hear voices carrying across the desert air. Veronica and Harold, standing in her driveway, having what they thought was a private conversation. "We can't let this spread," Veronica was saying, her voice sharp with panic. "If other neighborhoods start copying this tire garden nonsense, it'll undermine everything we've built here. Property values need to stay exclusive, not accessible." Exclusive, not accessible. Let that phrase marinate in your brain. "The Torres problem needs to end," Harold replied. "My wife's getting questions from other board members about our consulting contracts." I had my phone out recording before my brain fully processed what I was hearing. "We'll offer him a settlement," Veronica continued. "Make it look generous, but get those tire eyesores removed. If he doesn't take it, we escalate to the nuclear option." Nuclear option. That sounded ominous and illegal. Friday afternoon, like clockwork, Veronica showed up at my door with Harold and Janet, looking like a suburban assassination squad. "Mr. Torres, this has gone far enough. We're prepared to settle all fines for $200 if you remove the tire displays. Additionally," she said, voice dripping with fake honey, "favorable coverage in my real estate newsletter highlighting your property's potential." Translation: "Stop making our neighborhood look like regular people can afford to live here." I looked at this woman trying to bribe me into erasing the most beautiful thing I'd created since Sarah died, and felt something click into place like a weapon being chambered. "Mrs. Hartwell," I said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, "I wouldn't remove these gardens for $1 million. They represent everything this community could be instead of everything you've made it." Her mask slipped for just a second, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Then you've made your choice, Mr. Torres. I hope you can live with the consequences." The smell of blooming desert marigolds mixed with the scent of war being officially declared. That weekend, while Veronica was probably plotting my suburban assassination, I was deep in the dusty archives of the Maricopa County Recorder's Office, surrounded by boxes of documents that smelled like forgotten secrets and bureaucratic cover-ups. Dorothy had insisted on coming along. 40 years of municipal records experience doesn't just evaporate when you retire, honey. What we found didn't just change the game. It obliterated the entire playing field. The original Willowbrook Estates covenant from 1987 was a revelation wrapped in legal dynamite. Page 23, section 4.7, buried under dense language about community enhancement initiatives, contained a clause that made my pulse spike like a combat pilot pulling G's. No assessment or fine imposed by the homeowners association may exceed the actual documented cost of remediation or repair required to bring a property into compliance. Actual documented cost. Not arbitrary punishment fees, not Veronica's personal piggy bank penalty structure. "Sweet mother of pearl," Dorothy whispered, adjusting her reading glasses. "Marcus, do you understand what this means?" It meant every fine Veronica had issued in the past 3 years was not just wrong. It was criminally fraudulent. Miguel's $300 truck violation should have been $0. No remediation required for legal parking. Dorothy's garden gnome citation, maybe $20 to store them during inspection. My $750 tire fine, the cost of a U-Haul rental, maximum $89. But here's the thermonuclear bomb buried in those yellowing papers. Harold's signature on a 1987 addendum that he'd obviously prayed everyone had forgotten. As an original board member, he'd legally agreed that any modification to the original covenant required written approval from 67% of all homeowners, not just the 3-person board. Every single rule change Veronica had implemented for 6 years was completely invalid. "Dorothy," I said, my voice barely steady, "how much money do you think they've stolen in illegal fines?" She was already calculating on her phone, fingers flying like she was defusing a bomb. "Based on what I've documented, conservatively, $250,000 over 5 years. $250,000, enough to buy 10 modest houses in working-class Phoenix, stolen from neighbors one fraudulent citation at a time. But the real smoking gun came from a manila folder marked Board Transition 2018. documents from when Veronica seized power. The previous president, Robert Chen, had been asking uncomfortable questions about landscaping contracts and mysterious administrative fees before he suddenly decided to relocate for family reasons. Decided. Right. Dorothy found his forwarding address and phone number in the transition files. I called him that evening, hands actually shaking as I dialed. Robert, this is Marcus Torres from Willowbrook. I'm the guy with the tire gardens driving Veronica Hartwell insane. His laugh was sharp and bitter. Oh, you're that guy. I saw the news story. Good for you, man. Someone finally needs to burn her little dictatorship to the ground. Robert, I need to know why you really left the board. The silence stretched for 15 heartbeats before he spoke, voice heavy with years of suppressed anger. I found massive discrepancies in the financial records, contracts with board members' companies that violated every conflict of interest law on the books. When I started demanding answers, Veronica destroyed my life. Frivolous violations, daily harassment, threats about liens and foreclosure. I had twin daughters starting college and couldn't afford a legal war. Did you document any of it? Everything. Every fraudulent contract, every illegal fine, every threat. I've been sitting on 5 years of evidence waiting for someone with the balls to use it. The power shift was seismic and instantaneous. Veronica thought she was crushing one stubborn retiree with garden ambitions. She had no idea she'd accidentally triggered a federal investigation that would expose years of systematic fraud, embezzlement, and corruption. The most beautiful part? She'd engineered her own destruction through pure arrogance and greed. If she'd just left my father's tires alone, her criminal enterprise could have continued indefinitely. Instead, she'd declared war on someone who specialized in finding why systems failed catastrophically. Dorothy, I said, spreading Robert's evidence across my kitchen table like battle plans. Time to call that attorney. She smiled with 40 years of accumulated justice finally about to be served. Monday morning, my garage transformed from a shrine to Dad's memories into a full-scale war room that would make a Pentagon strategist weep with envy. Whiteboards covered every wall, marked with flowcharts connecting Veronica's crimes like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. File cabinets lined the workbench where I used to restore carburetors. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with righteous fury and the sweet scent of desert marigolds blooming in my tire gardens just outside. Dorothy arrived at 7 a.m. sharp with a legal pad, reading glasses, and the focused intensity of someone who'd spent 40 years watching bureaucratic bullies get away with murder. All right, honey, she said, rolling up sleeves that had seen 4 decades of municipal battles. Let's build a case that'll make the FBI send thank you cards. Blake showed up after school to handle digital warfare because apparently 16-year-olds understand social media strategy better than retired aircraft mechanics. Miguel brought his contractor's knowledge of municipal codes and permit processes. We'd assembled the most unlikely legal strike team in suburban Phoenix history, and we were out for blood. The 3-pronged legal assault, prong 1, covenant violation, nuclear option. Dorothy's calculations were devastating. $247,000 in illegal fines collected from 89 homeowners over 5 years. Using the 1987 Covenant's actual cost clause, we could demand full refunds plus interest. But here's the beautiful part. Arizona law allows triple damages for fraudulent collection practices. Veronica's $250,000 theft could become a $750,000 judgment. Legal nugget. Original HOA covenants often contain ironclad homeowner protections that later boards systematically ignore, hoping residents never discover their founding documents. Takeaway: the original covenant is your constitutional protection. Demand it and use it. Prong 2. Forensic financial destruction. Robert's evidence revealed corruption so brazen it was almost artistic. The Hartwell crime family had created a network of shell companies that would make the mafia jealous. Harold's son's environmental consulting, $15,000 for walking around twice. Veronica's husband's landscaping, $5,000 for trimming bushes that didn't need trimming. Janet's administrative support, $200 per hour for typing meeting minutes that a middle schooler could handle. Sarah Martinez, our forensic accountant, took one look at the evidence and started laughing like she'd won the lottery. This is the cleanest case of systematic embezzlement I've seen in 20 years, she said, spreading financial documents across my kitchen table like tarot cards predicting doom. They documented everything because they thought they were untouchable gods. The texture of those bank records felt like weapons in my hands. Prong 3. Federal Fair Housing Annihilation. The discrimination was so obvious it was insulting to our intelligence. Miguel's work truck, $300 violation. Janet's identical pickup, invisible to enforcement. Dorothy's 4 garden gnomes, criminal offense. Harold's yard full of pool equipment and boat parts, perfectly acceptable suburban landscape. My HUD complaint included testimony from 23 neighbors documenting selective enforcement based on income, race, and whether you kissed Veronica's ring properly. Federal investigators don't mess around with housing discrimination. It's a career-making case for ambitious prosecutors. Our evening strategy sessions in Dorothy's living room had grown from 3 rebels to 47 households ready to burn Veronica's empire to the ground. Every neighbor had horror stories that would make Stalin blush. Mrs. Patterson fined for bird feeders that attracted undesirable wildlife. Apparently, hummingbirds were gang members now. The Johnsons cited for parking incorrectly in their own driveway, 3 inches over some imaginary line that existed only in Veronica's fevered imagination. Blake's Willowbrook Truth Facebook group became our digital headquarters, coordinating testimony, sharing evidence, and planning the special election that would end Veronica's reign of suburban terror. Professional survey proving tire garden compliance, check. Soil testing showing 0 contamination, check. Property appraisal confirming 12% value increase from creative landscaping, devastating, check. But our nuclear weapon was Dorothy's 40 years of municipal warfare experience. She knew which forms to file, which bureaucrats owed favors, and exactly how to weaponize government red tape against the people who'd been using it as a weapon. Legal nuggets for maximum damage. Nugget 1. Forensic accounting exposes HOA fraud by following vendor payment patterns and shell company networks. Nugget 2. Federal discrimination complaints trigger FBI investigations that can result in criminal charges. Nugget 3. Original covenants. Trump later amendments that weren't properly approved by required resident percentages. Special election to remove Veronica, 6 weeks. Media expose featuring corruption evidence, week before election. Federal complaint escalation, imminent. Forensic accounting bombshell report, 2 weeks. Class action lawsuit filing coordinated for maximum psychological warfare. Every evening, my garage buzzed with the sweet sound of justice being assembled piece by methodical piece. The gentle hum of tire garden irrigation mixed with the clicking of keyboards building digital dossiers of corruption. Veronica thought she was crushing one stubborn retiree with garden delusions. She had no idea she was about to face a coordinated federal investigation, forensic accounting audit, media exposure, and community uprising that would turn her suburban dictatorship into the biggest HOA corruption scandal in Arizona history. The smell of victory was already in the desert air. 3 days after our war room strategy session, I woke up to botanical carnage that looked like a hate crime against desert plants. My tire gardens were obliterated, every desert marigold ripped from the soil and scattered across my driveway like murdered sunshine. Barrel cacti uprooted and hurled against my garage door, leaving green pulp stains. The drip irrigation lines were slashed into confetti, creating muddy pools that reflected the early morning sky like tears. 12 beautiful tire planters that had taken weeks to establish looked like they'd been carpet-bombed by someone with a personal vendetta against photosynthesis. But here's the thing about 30 years of aircraft maintenance. You learn to think like someone trying to sabotage million-dollar machines. So I'd installed a professional security system 2 weeks earlier, complete with night vision cameras and motion sensors sensitive enough to detect a desert mouse at 50 yards. The 2 a.m. footage was absolutely gorgeous. A figure in white tennis outfit and designer sneakers, moving systematically from tire to tire, uprooting plants with the methodical fury of someone having a complete psychological collapse. The infrared cameras captured every detail as Veronica Hartwell personally destroyed my gardens while appearing to curse at innocent cacti that couldn't defend themselves. While I'm reviewing footage that would make a federal prosecutor start planning victory celebrations, my phone rings. Detective Sarah Rodriguez from Phoenix PD, responding to my vandalism report. Mr. Torres, I've reviewed the preliminary footage. This isn't just property damage, it's criminal harassment and destruction of evidence in an ongoing federal investigation. Federal investigation. Those beautiful words meant my HUD complaint had triggered something much bigger than I'd anticipated. Detective, I said, trying to contain my satisfaction. there's additional context about the suspect's escalating pattern of retaliation. I spent the next hour walking her through Veronica's harassment campaign, the documented financial fraud, and her systematic targeting of residents who dared oppose her suburban tyranny. By the time I finished, Rodriguez looked like someone had just handed her a career-making case wrapped in a bow. But I wasn't just documenting crimes. I was rebuilding my gardens into something that would make Veronica's vandalism look pathetic. Elena from Desert Bloom Nursery arrived that afternoon with a truck full of replacement plants and a grin that could power the entire grid. When Blake posted about the vandalism, half of Phoenix wanted to donate plants. We've got enough desert flowers to create the most spectacular garden in Arizona. The community response was overwhelming. Miguel showed up with professional irrigation equipment and security lighting. Dorothy organized a neighborhood planting party that drew 30 volunteers. Complete strangers arrived with cactus seedlings and offers to help rebuild something even more beautiful. By sunset, my tire gardens were more magnificent than before, now surrounded by motion-activated sprinkler systems that Miguel had strategically positioned for plant protection, though they seemed suspiciously aimed at anyone lurking around after dark. Meanwhile, Veronica was having her very public breakdown. Wednesday morning, Channel 12 was broadcasting live about community resilience in the face of vandalism, when Veronica made the catastrophic mistake of confronting the news crew in my front yard. The cameras were rolling when she started shrieking about media conspiracies and certain types of people who were destroying everything decent about this neighborhood. The reporter, displaying beautiful journalistic instincts, asked Veronica to clarify what she meant by certain types of people. "You know exactly what I mean," Veronica screamed, her perfect mask finally shattering like cheap veneer in desert heat. "Working-class people with their junk cars and tire displays who don't understand property values or how decent communities should look." The discriminatory rant was captured in high definition, broadcast live across Phoenix, and uploaded to social media where it spread faster than wildfire in August. That evening, Harold and Janet appeared at my door looking like condemned prisoners requesting final meals. "Mr. Torres," Harold stammered, voice shaking, "we need to discuss removing Veronica from the board immediately. This situation has become completely untenable." Translation: the accomplices were abandoning their sinking dictator. "We never consented to criminal activity," Janet added, wringing her hands like she was trying to scrub off years of complicity. "The vandalism, harassment, public threats, this exceeds anything we agreed to support." I almost burst out laughing. These people had been Veronica's eager enablers for years, collecting kickbacks and ignoring neighbor harassment. Now that federal investigators were asking uncomfortable questions, suddenly they'd discovered their moral compasses. But military training teaches you, never interrupt enemies when they're destroying themselves. "That's between you and your attorneys," I said calmly. "I'm confident the FBI will appreciate hearing about your willingness to cooperate with their investigation." The smell of their terror mixed with evening scents from my rebuilt gardens, where motion sensors hummed quietly and security cameras recorded every shadow and whisper. Veronica had escalated to criminal vandalism and televised discriminatory meltdowns. I'd responded by transforming her crimes into federal evidence while building an even more spectacular garden protected by technology that could detect a butterfly landing on a cactus flower. She was thrashing like a cornered predator, destroying everything within reach. I was operating like someone who'd spent 3 decades ensuring complex systems continued functioning even when critical components failed explosively. The final battle was approaching, and everyone except Veronica could see how this war would end. The Willowbrook Community Center had never witnessed anything like this reckoning. 237 residents crammed into a space designed for 50, with overflow crowds spilling into the parking lot where Channel 12 had erected a live broadcast stage. The air crackled with electricity you could taste, part anticipation, part righteous fury, and part the intoxicating satisfaction of watching a tyrant finally face public execution. I arrived at 6:45 p.m. for the 7 o'clock special election, walking through a gauntlet of news cameras and neighbors who'd transformed from victims into warriors. Dorothy gripped my arm as we entered. 40 years of municipal battles," she whispered, eyes gleaming, "and I've never seen justice this beautiful." The media circus was spectacular. 3 Phoenix television stations broadcasting live, radio crews, independent journalists, and Blake coordinating social media coverage that was already trending nationwide. This wasn't just a neighborhood meeting. It was the public demolition of suburban authoritarianism, streamed live for the world to witness. Veronica sat alone at the head table looking like she'd aged 20 years in 2 weeks. Her trademark perfect hair showed desperate gray roots, her designer armor was wrinkled and stained, and her hands trembled as she tried to control proceedings that had exploded beyond her comprehension. County Election Supervisor Janet Martinez called the meeting to order with the authority of someone overseeing historical justice. This special election was petitioned by 67% of Willowbrook residents to address systematic financial fraud and discriminatory enforcement, 67%. The exact threshold required by the original 1987 covenant to override any board decision. Harold and Janet, the former board co-conspirators, were notably absent, probably in federal custody or meeting with prosecutors about their plea bargains. Veronica sat abandoned at the leadership table like a dictator whose entire regime had collapsed overnight. The mic drop moment arrived when I approached the podium. 6 months ago, I began, my voice carrying across the packed room like a battle cry, Veronica Hartwell fined me $500 for honoring my father's memory. Tonight, I'm going to show you what her harassment campaign was really designed to accomplish. I clicked to my first slide, the discrimination evidence that made the crowd gasp audibly. Miguel's work truck, $300 violation. Janet's identical pickup, invisible to enforcement. Dorothy's 4 garden gnomes, criminal offense. Harold's maritime junkyard, perfectly acceptable suburban landscape. The murmurs built like thunder before a monsoon. But financial discrimination was just the appetizer, I continued, advancing to forensic accounting that made several people stand up in shock. The main course was systematic theft disguised as community protection. The charts were devastating, $247,000 in illegal fines, $156,000 in fraudulent shell company contracts, federal tax evasion, wire fraud, racketeering. Veronica Hartwell didn't just break HOA rules, I said, staring directly at her as she visibly deflated. She turned this community into her personal ATM, using fear, discrimination, and federal crimes. Then I delivered the line that would be quoted in every news story. She tried to fine me into submission for keeping my father's tires. Instead, she taught me that corruption grows like weeds, but justice blooms like desert flowers when you water it with evidence and patience. The applause was deafening. That's when Special Agent Rebecca Chen stood up. The FBI financial crimes agent had been sitting quietly in the back row, but now she moved toward Veronica with the measured pace of federal justice finally arriving. Veronica Hartwell, you're under arrest for wire fraud, tax evasion, racketeering, and violation of federal housing discrimination laws. The handcuffs clicking shut in absolute silence was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. As Agent Chen recited Miranda rights, the community erupted in applause that seemed to shake the building's foundation. Camera flashes exploded like celebration fireworks. Live television captured every moment of suburban tyranny meeting federal consequences. But the most satisfying moment came when Veronica finally spoke. "This is all a conspiracy!" she shrieked as Agent Chen guided her toward the exit. "You people don't understand property values! You don't deserve to live in a community like this!" The mask had completely disintegrated, revealing the ugly truth underneath. Even her lawyer looked embarrassed. Dorothy's victory was poetry in motion. Standing with the dignity of 78 years of accumulated wisdom, she announced her candidacy for HOA president with a platform of financial transparency, equal enforcement, and community gardens for every family that wants one. The vote, 237 for Dorothy, 0 for anyone else. The resolution avalanche followed. All illegal fines refunded with interest. Unanimous complete forensic audit of HOA finances. Unanimous new covenant protecting homeowner creativity. Unanimous official designation of tire gardens as environmental innovation. Standing ovation. As federal agents escorted Veronica past my blooming tire gardens toward their vehicle, neighbors poured outside to witness the perp walk. The desert marigolds glowed under parking lot lights like golden victory torches celebrating the end of an era. My final statement to the cameras. Tyranny dies when communities stop being afraid and start being creative. Tonight, Willowbrook chose beauty over fear, justice over corruption, and community over control. The scent of desert blooms mixed with the sweet smell of democracy working exactly as designed. Veronica's abandoned Mercedes would be seized by federal asset forfeiture. my father's tire gardens would bloom forever. 6 months later, Willowbrook Estates had transformed from suburban dystopia into something magical that nobody could have imagined when this all started with 12 tire planters and one power-hungry dictator. Veronica Hartwell was serving 18 months in federal minimum security prison for wire fraud, tax evasion, and civil rights violations. Her husband's landscaping empire had collapsed after losing municipal contracts and facing their own fraud charges. The infamous white Mercedes had been auctioned by federal marshals, with proceeds funding victim restitution that put real money back in neighbors' pockets. But the real transformation was happening in our community's soul. Dorothy had become the most beloved HOA president in Willowbrook history, running monthly meetings where residents actually solved problems instead of creating them. Financial transparency was absolute. Every expenditure posted online, every contract publicly bid, every decision voted on by neighbors who showed up because they finally trusted their leadership again. The tire garden revolution had exploded across Arizona like desert wildfire. 47 neighborhoods had created their own versions, transforming automotive waste into community art that conserved water, supported native wildlife, and brought neighbors together around shared creativity. Arizona State University adopted our model as required study in their environmental justice program. Miguel had leveraged his expertise into desert community consulting, helping neighborhoods fight HOA overreach while creating sustainable landscapes. Dorothy's herb garden anchored a senior citizens cooperative, producing 2,000 pounds of fresh vegetables annually for local food banks. Blake had earned a full scholarship to study environmental engineering, with his tire garden research winning statewide recognition. The legislative impact was extraordinary. Arizona passed the Willowbrook HOA Reform Act, requiring financial transparency, limiting fines to actual remediation costs, and protecting homeowner creativity from arbitrary aesthetic tyranny. National coverage had sparked similar battles nationwide, with my tire gardens becoming an icon of grassroots resistance to suburban authoritarianism. Knowledge nuggets that changed everything. Original HOA covenants protect homeowners better than later amendments. Always demand founding documents. First, federal fair housing complaints expose discrimination patterns triggering criminal investigations. Systematic documentation is your weapon. Forensic accounting reveals HOA corruption by following vendor payments in shell companies. Always follow the money trail. Creative compliance transforms restrictions into community-building opportunities. Rules are starting points, not prison walls. But the most profound transformation was deeply personal. My tire gardens had evolved into living memorials to Dad and Sarah that celebrated resilience instead of mourning loss. Every morning, I'd water the thriving desert marigolds and barrel cacti while neighbors stopped by for coffee and stories. The gentle hum of irrigation mixed with children's laughter as they learned about desert ecology from plants growing in recycled rubber. The sweet scent of blooming lantana reminded me daily that beautiful things grow from the most unlikely circumstances when you refuse to surrender to bullies. The social impact exceeded every dream. The Willowbrook Environmental Justice Scholarship had grown into a $45,000 endowment funding college education for low-income students, fighting environmental racism and suburban inequality. Our tire garden network produced over 2,000 pounds of food annually. The rainwater collection system reduced neighborhood water usage by 30%, earning Phoenix Water Conservation Council recognition. My daughter visited from Seattle for our first annual Desert Bloom Festival, tears in her eyes as she stood where it all began. "Dad," she whispered, touching a thriving barrel cactus, "Mom would be so proud. You turned grief into hope and anger into beauty." 5,000 people attended that festival, including families who'd started their own community garden rebellions. Local businesses donated supplies. The mayor declared Willowbrook a model sustainable community. Children played between tire gardens while parents shared stories of defeating their own suburban tyrants. The healing was complete when former enemies became allies. Harold and Janet had completed community service sentences and become valuable volunteers for Dorothy's transparency initiatives. Our neighborhood, once divided by fear and manufactured conflict, was now united by shared gardens, monthly potlucks, and collective pride in proving ordinary people could defeat institutional corruption through patience, evidence, and community solidarity. But this wasn't the end of my HOA adventures. Last week, residents from Scottsdale called about their board trying to ban vegetable gardens as agricultural violations. Tomorrow, Dorothy and I are loading up evidence binders and tire planters for another battle. Because once you've tasted the satisfaction of turning bureaucratic harassment into federal prison sentences, it's impossible to resist sharing that recipe with other communities fighting suburban tyranny. Share your worst HOA nightmare in the comments below. I personally read every story and respond with specific advice about fighting back legally and creatively. Subscribe for more stories of neighbors defeating petty authoritarianism. Hit that notification bell because next week's Scottsdale Vegetable Garden War will restore your faith in community power. The desert marigolds are blooming eternal, justice grows like wildflowers after rain, and somewhere out there another HOA president is about to discover that underestimating retired aircraft mechanics is a life-changing mistake.